Right, and I want to spend a bit of time talking about the book of Acts and its place in the New Testament, and just give you a bit of a flavour of what might be the key thing going on in the book of Acts. First of all, just to say that the book of Acts fits together with Luke's Gospel. If you've never noticed this before, at the beginning of Acts, it talks about Luke's Gospel. It says, in my former volume, I did certain things. And so Luke Acts, scholars will think of Luke Acts as a single thing, 2 volumes. Intriguingly, you've got what you might say Jesus did in Luke. And then in the beginning of the book of Acts, it says, in my former volume, I told you what Jesus began to do and teach. Almost as if the book of Acts tells us what Jesus continued to do and teach. Now, if you know the book of Acts, you know that actually the ascension happens in chapter 1. But interestingly, the author is saying, no, the whole of the book of Acts is what Jesus continues to do and teach. He's just now doing it through his body, the Christian disciples, and potentially, you might say, through the Holy Spirit. So we have Luke Acts as a sort of single volume with 2 parts to it, the Gospel of Luke and then the book of Acts. What's going on overall in that story? I want to suggest it's like this. Luke starts in the most sort of Jewish traditional framework you can imagine. Luke chapter 1, you've got an old couple who haven't got children, Zechariah and Elizabeth. He's a priest. It starts off with him going and doing his duty as a priest in the Jewish temple, a pious old Jewish couple. And the book of Acts ends with Paul preaching, unhindered, boldly, the gospel of Jesus in Rome. So Rome, the centre of the world, the centre of the Roman world. And so Luke, together with Acts, is the story about how this traditional Jewish faith moved right from that traditional Jewish heartland to be a gospel being preached unhindered in Rome to Gentiles. The books are dedicated to a name Theophilus. Now, there's all sorts of arguments about is this a real person or not. But if you imagine someone sitting at their vineyard in Naples, a Roman official, his question is, how on earth has this traditional Jewish religion come to me? And is it a legitimate development? Is it right that this Jewish traditional God is bringing salvation and transformation to me? And so Luke Acts, and particularly the book of Acts, tells that story. You think even in the book of Acts, it starts with the believers being in the temple. In Luke 24 and in Acts 1 and 2, the Christian believers in the temple, it's a Jewish operation in the Jewish temple. And we see this movement to this being a worldwide religion. The book of Acts seems to have 4 parts to it. And of course, people chop it up in different ways, but I think this works to say 4 parts. Bang in the middle, absolutely in the middle of the book, you have what people call the Council of Jerusalem. It's clearly the most important bit because it's the only place where multiple apostles speak. Paul, Peter, and James all speak in the same conversation. And this is a conversation about in what way the Gentiles should be allowed in. If you look at it in more detail, you've got the first quarter of the book, chapters 1 to 7, is all about the church in Jerusalem. Church in Jerusalem, Jewish, that's what you might expect. You then have chapters 8 to 15, which seems to be breaking the boundaries. We start off with the Samaritans receiving faith in Jesus. And we have the Ethiopian eunuch who, according to the Jewish law, couldn't be a full part of the people. And then this spreads to the pious, God-fearing centurion Cornelius, but who was a Gentile. And then when we get to chapters 13 and 14, we find Paul and Barnabas preaching to real Gentiles in the villages in what's now southern Turkey. So we have this transition of breaking the boundaries about who is allowed to be part of God's people. And all the way through that, we have no end of miracles demonstrating that this development is God's will. It's not just the story of what happened. God was in it. And then we have this Jerusalem Council which discusses it. Then we have chapters 16 to 21, where we see Paul having his mission among Gentiles and that working. Gentiles coming to faith in Jesus. And then the final quarter of the book, which again we have to account for in some way. The final quarter of the book, Paul is arrested and he gives multiple defence speeches. Depending how you count them, there's 6 or 7 times Paul's defence is rehearsed. Why? Why go on about it so much? And why is because it's so controversial. What has happened of this expansion of the boundaries, the breaking of the boundaries, is so controversial. And so Paul repeatedly defends this spread of the message about Jesus to the outsiders, to the Gentiles. So it's a story of the breaking of these boundaries. We're going from a traditional Jewish setting all the way across to this worldwide religion in which Gentiles have an equal part. 2 things which follow from that. First of all, it's worth us just noticing, worth noticing what's going on here. The Council of Jerusalem and in all these discussions, nobody was saying that Gentiles couldn't become followers of Jesus. The argument was whether in the process they needed to take on Jewish practices. It was not an argument in that sense about salvation. It was an argument about how the church ought to live, the church's culture, the practical living. And when you came to faith in Jesus, should you adopt the practices and culture of our Jewish ancestors? That's what it's about. Should they follow the Jewish law? No one was saying they couldn't come to Jesus, but should they take on the Jewish practices, take on the practices of the roots of the faith? And what we see through this is in the apostles' discussions, but also through the miracles from God, the activity of the Spirit, is that the answer is no. These people coming to faith come to faith in Jesus and don't need to take on the practices of their ancestors in the faith. Intriguingly, in chapter 15, in the Council of Jerusalem, there's a sense very clearly they don't need to take on these practices, but there are a few things that could they please do. As if there's some sense of they don't need to, but there's some things that the ancestors in the faith will just find so annoying it would help. It would produce more harmony if people followed them. But nevertheless, the answer is the new folks don't need to follow the practices of the roots of the faith. So we grasp that. The second point then is, what does this mean for us? When we look at our churches, we have ways of doing things. We have ways of doing things. I always laugh a little bit at the idea that when I was brought up, what I was taught and what almost everyone in our country would do is if you go around to someone's house, you offer them a drink, don't you? Whether they want a drink or not, you offer them a drink. Someone comes to your house, you offer them a drink. You go into church, no, you've got to have the service first, and then you're offered a drink. Well, what is this? Are Christians so inhospitable? What do they think? You can have a drink and then go home without hearing the sermon? Everywhere else in our culture, hospitality means come in, would you like a drink? The church doesn't do that. Now, you might say that's trivial. What I'm just trying to illustrate is we have ways of behaving which don't match the culture that we're in. We have ways in which we act, we speak, we behave in our churches. And what would it mean if we thought that this story of Acts applies to us in the same way? That we should be inviting people to become followers of Jesus, but saying you don't need to follow our practices. The Jewish practices were at least commanded by God in the Old Testament, and yet they decided the new converts didn't need to follow them. And what sort of things might I mean? I suppose on a list here, what would it mean if someone comes to a faith in Jesus? Should they stop swearing? Should they start wearing a different style of more respectable clothes? Should they get a job? Should they stop smoking? Should they stop smoking pot? Should they marry their long-term partner? These are all the sorts of issues where, as a church, we might have ways of life. And what Acts asks us to do is to say, are these ways of life actually part of the gospel? Or are these like the Jewish practices, things which are fine for us, this is how we've been brought up, this is our culture, but they're not to be imposed on the new believers? So the story of Acts tells us the story of the breaking of boundaries so that God's love, that message of God's love, the transformation of God's Spirit in our lives, Acts is the story of the breaking of boundaries so that reaches all people. And practices and ways of behaving which are traditional can be left on one side. And so what does that mean for us? What does it mean for our churches or ways of relating to the community? If we took the same, you need to ponder whether this is right, but if we took the same approach to say, introducing people to faith in Jesus, meeting Jesus is what matters, we give up on our traditional practices, or at least we don't impose them on new people.